I'm Jim Robbins. I'm the Dean of Academics here at the Institute of World Politics. Thank you all for coming out for the Chancellor's Council meeting. We have an exciting program for you today, really interesting people talking about fascinating things. I think you'll enjoy it. So before we begin, if you would please join me in standing if you're able. Place your hand over heart as we recite the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You may be seated. This is always one of my favorite events of the year because we have so many interesting people talking about great things, and I always learn a lot. It's interesting to hear what our faculty are up to, and we're going to have some student speakers and other interesting folks telling you things. So hopefully you can make the whole event. If you have to come and go, that's also fine. And I know everybody's really looking forward to the gala tonight. So. Our first speaker was to be Joe Billingsley, but the stork arrived. And so his wife gave birth to a child, so understandably, Joe couldn't make it. But we do have another speaker lined up for you, a student of ours, Michael DiCianna. And Michael just took a trip to Ukraine over the summer. And so he's going to share some of his insights on the current state of conflict in Ukraine and the future of the war. Mike is a senior consultant at a government contractor. Additionally, he's a visiting fellow at the Transatlantic Dialogue Center, a research assistant at Yorktown Institute, and a research fellow at IWP's Center for Intermarium Studies. Michael is a national security professional with almost a decade of experience contracting and consulting in the U.S. government across various agencies. His political, military, and strategic commentary has been featured in a number of publications, including the Daily Telegraph Online. Michael graduated from Duquesne University with a bachelor's degree in political science and government, and is currently pursuing a Master of Arts in National Security Affairs from IWP, and is taking my course, 627, with me and Dr. Lanchowski. Today he's speaking in his personal capacity and not on behalf of any organization. So welcome to Michael. Here we are.
Hello, I'd like to say good morning to everyone. Thank you to our council members for your support of IWP. As Dr. Robbins said, I will be speaking about the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war. This is going to be both about my travels through Ukraine through most of July and August of this year, the state of the war as it is now, and what future outlooks look like. I'd like to say, while I did this trip before becoming a student at IWP, but in the middle of applying to it, I'd like to thank the awesome faculty, staff, and other resources available to me at IWP that allow me to continue this line of research. I still have a network of journalists and experts, and so again, the fixers I have in Ukraine that are contributing to publications, research, and even schoolwork I'm doing with the school. And IWP is the kind of place that makes research and work like this worth pursuing and greatly enhances it. So about me, I was a Duquesne University grad 2016. I work with a handful of think tanks. Yorktown is based here in DC. The Transatlantic Dialogue Center is actually a Kyiv-based think tank. And now I'm with IWP's Center for Intermarium Studies. So the war now. The unfortunate fact is, if someone asked me how's the war going for the Ukrainians in October 2024, is not well. The Russian forces are advancing in the Donbass, the region in southeastern Ukraine that Russia has been contesting since 2014. Russians have also still pushing in northeastern Ukraine, although their offensive to take Kharkiv city, the second largest city in Ukraine, has essentially stopped in its tracks, but has caused a severe devastation. Russia continues a war of terror against Ukraine, bombarding Ukrainian civilian targets and energy infrastructure. They're actually engaging in a campaign deliberately targeting civilians in Kherson City using first-person view drones to target civilian crowds. But the Ukrainians are continuing their offensive into Kursk Oblast, where they've seized a significant amount of Russian territory. The Ukrainians have seized in the last month about as much territory as the Russians have seized in the last 18 months of the full-scale invasion. Ukraine continues to pummel Russian targets both in Russia and in the occupied regions. This weekend, they successfully attacked an energy terminal in occupied Crimea. And on the diplomatic front, what's more important is Ukraine's ongoing effort to get Western permission to use long-range Western weapons to target valid military targets inside Russia. So, like as I said, the situation is, I wouldn't say bleak now, but Russia definitely has the strategic initiative, although they're keeping it at an immense cost in Russian lives and Russian materiel. But it's important, as we discuss that, we reflect on where things could be. This is the 958th day of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which started in February 2022. It's been 10 years since the annexation of Crimea and the Russian support of separatists in the Donbass. The Ukrainians I've spoken to, soldiers, civilians, political leaders, they view this as part of a much longer conflict that they have with the Russians. They date it back to their 1991 independence from the Soviet Union. Some Ukrainian historians view it as a continuation of the Ukrainian War of Independence that happened as part of the Russian Revolution and the collapse of the Russian Empire. And it's always vital to reflect that this was, as I said, 958 days into Putin's 3-day campaign to seize what he called the Nazi regime in Kiev, the Russian name for the city. Had that happened as Russian expected and many Western intelligence experts and geopolitical experts expected, we would be looking at a Russia that has not only seized Ukraine's strategic territory, its strategic minerals, including a lot of uranium, a major portion of the world's grain supply. They would also have a massive border with several NATO allies, Poland, Slovakia, and serious dominance over the Black Sea. Now the Russians essentially have almost no naval forces in the Black Sea. They've been pushed out of Sevastopol and are basing most of their fleet in occupied Georgian ports because the Ukrainians keep sinking theirs. The Ukrainians are standing. Kyiv remains in Ukrainian hands. And as you'll see from what I've spoken to, the Ukrainian urge to fight this out towards victory on their terms is substantial. Little background of my background of the conflict. I was in my undergraduate when Russia seized Crimea. I always joke we were studying counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, subjects like that were still pertinent, but the top of the list for poli-sci international relations study in 2014. And then Putin began his disruption of the global order by his sneaky annexation of Crimea and starting a low-intensity ground war in eastern Ukraine. I should say, as you may tell, I'm not unbiased in this, and I'm quite passionate about it. I have deep respect for the Ukrainian war effort, and I have a deep sympathy for the Ukrainian urge to pivot west, to democratize, to deal with the corruption in their country, and to be free of Russian influence. So here's just a little quick. My trip took me flying through Poland, taking a bus, which was a huge mistake, I'll say that, from the Polish border to Kyiv, and then on to a city called Kramatorsk in Donetsk Oblast. On the next slide, we'll see in a second, you actually see how close that is to the Russian front line. My task ahead of me was to embed with troops, to which I got a press pass, meet some volunteers, a mixture of logistics experts and medical experts who support the Ukrainian war effort, and then conduct some meetings and research back in Kyiv on my return trip. So, what did this involve? Getting a press pass. I've, over the last year or so, made a connection with various frontline volunteers and fixers. Ukraine has sort of a gig economy developed of journalists and the experts who support them, people who know how to drive around the area, people who know where the good connections are, safe places to stay. I've been building that up. I built that up over the last year or so before embarking on my trip. And so this is part of my mission, was to get some firsthand experience in a conflict that I think is both incredibly geopolitically important to the United States, to the transatlantic relationship, but also important to America's defense industry, defense technology. The war in Ukraine has seen all number of major and subtle changes in how war is being fought, and frankly, I do not believe the U.S. government, the U.S. Department of Defense, has enough eyes, certainly has not enough eyes on the ground, not even enough scholarly work, and thus, that's a big part of my studies and my work with IWP. Will be continuing writing about this, researching this, and advocating it so the U.S. can benefit from the experience being gained. A little bit about volunteers in Ukraine. This is one of the things that has inspired me to travel there also, was just the network of both Ukrainian and foreign volunteers who provide irreplaceable support to the Ukrainian war effort, fundraising for drones, drone jammers, medical supplies. Great deal of medical professionals from all over the world are there. I met Americans, Brits, Norwegians, Mexican, Israeli, Pakistani citizens, surgeons, former combat medics in some instances, going out of their way to support. This was my fixer and my point of contact in Ukraine. Her name is Rima Nikogosian. She's a native of the city of Kramatorsk. I've known her for about 2 years or so. She is a full-time volunteer on the front line, including some direct volunteer for some Ukrainian special operations units I had the opportunity to embed with. She was the reason this trip was able to happen. I just wanted to give her my support, so I figured I'd throw a slide in here. And in case anyone else is thinking it, because all my friends and classmates have made the joke, no, I did not go all the way to a war zone just because of a redhead asking me to. I was just going to show, occasionally you hear diminutively, I don't know where Ukraine is on the map, it's just a little country in Europe. And occasionally, on the positive side, you hear, well, Ukraine's a small little country standing against Russia, and that is true. But whenever someone says, can't even identify Ukraine on the map, I'm sure no one in this room is guilty of it, but I always like having this slide for other presentations, other audiences. I go, well, if you can't find Ukraine on the map, and also this shows the strategic, as I said, the strategic importance of the Ukrainian continuing to survive and ideally win this war. If Ukraine would fall completely, as I said, that puts the Russian military and all of the Russian industry behind it, and the industry that they would capture from Ukraine on the Polish, Slovakian, Hungarian, and Romanian border. Here's a map of Ukraine. As I said, traveled through Kyiv first, and then later back through Kyiv. But where I stayed was about, on this map, just a little northwest of Donetsk city in Donetsk Oblast. This was the situation on the Donbass front when I arrived. If you can see on here, the city of Kramatorsk, very close to the Russian front line. While I was there, the Russians were pushing towards Chasiv Yar, and the Ukrainians had just moved to intercept them in the small town of Toretsk. Fighting while I was there began in the city of Pokrovsk. If anyone follows the Institute for the Study of War maps, Pokrovsk has been a battleground. Since I was there, when I arrived, the word on the ground was that the Ukrainians expected Pokrovsk to fall within days. Fighting has continued up till, as far as I've checked, I was speaking with soldiers this morning. The situation is dire. The Russians, as I said, are throwing almost unimaginable amounts of men and material to gain a few yards at a time in Donbass, but it is unfortunately working for now. Now, some of my work involved a exploration of the tactical changes that the Ukraine war has brought about. A general theory you see talked about by a lot of military experts of a great deal more expertise than me is how modern military technology has pushed it so that the defense has the ultimate advantage in modern warfare, akin to how the widespread use of the Maxim gun, the machine gun, led to the defensive advantage in World War I. Drones, other surveillance technology, and weight of artillery fire, which we'll also discuss here, has made it that gaining ground is incredibly difficult. It's led to these, not quite stalemates, but these long slogging battles. It was the reason for the Ukrainian 2023 offensive sort of falling short, is because the Russians had so much time to dig in, and the Ukrainians had neither the armor nor the air power to push through. So my interest in researching this was sort of understanding how the Ukrainians are adapting to a defensive environment when obviously their goal is to push the Russians out, but how they're handling when the Russians have the strategic initiative holding them off. And applying that to how the U.S. has to consider wars where we might be fighting on the strategic defensive, say a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, or heaven forbid, a Russian invasion of a NATO member. So I was able to tour various sites around Ukraine. The top picture here is me in Kramatorsk examining some trenches. That's my translator on the right of me. I was impressed by the Ukrainians have sort of adapted to being on the defensive. It's essentially culturally not where they want to be right now. They want to be taking the fight to the Russians. They want to be liberating their cities. But until they have the firepower and the manpower they need, they're unable to do that. So it's taken them longer than one might think, and probably problematically so, but they've really started to dig in. So I got to examine some fortifications, and I've done some writing about that, both and my hope to the benefit of the Ukrainians, but also discussing it with some DoD professionals. And yes, obviously in this picture, I'm wearing a polo shirt and short shorts. I was told to wear my ballistic vest everywhere, which was issued to me as my press pass. And while touring the trenches, I said to my translator, I said, "So, the Russians won't be shooting at me from this position. This is far enough away." And she said, "No, not really." So worse, we get shelled or bombed. And she said, "Yes." And it's unbelievably warm in Donbass at this time of year. So I put on my short shorts and my shirt, and I said, "Well, if we get shelled, I'll hop in the trench and I'll be fine. And if the trench takes a direct hit, it really won't matter what I'm wearing." The bottom is me practicing with some special operations soldiers. They wanted to take me shooting because they know Americans love shooting. That's me unable to pull the pin on a grenade. Tougher than you think. First thing they warned me was you cannot pull the pin out with your teeth like Rambo does. My most interesting embed, and the one that's had the most influence on my writing about not just the conflict itself, but the tactics of the conflict, was embedding with a Ukrainian special operations unit called the ETAI Special Intelligence Group. Ukraine has a number of units in its military that go by the term special operations or translate as such. Some are more akin to our SOCOM units. Others have more of an intelligence focus. Much of the drone activities are conducted by so-called special operations or special recon units. This is one of those. So the ETAI team, I've supported through fundraisers in the past. I met some of their members. That's their unit flag there with a Viking compass. This is actually a picture they took in Kursk Oblast. Shortly after I finished embedding with them, they were part of the Ukrainian incursion there. And while they can't publicly comment on it, I believe they've been involved in some of the long-range drone strikes the Ukrainians have since conducted against Russian military depots, ammunition dumps, and natural gas sites on the Russian side of the border. But the Ukrainians' ability to use drones, and also on the industry side, develop, design, and produce drones is really phenomenal. I'm sure anyone here who's followed the news at all about this war, the war in Gaza, drones have become such a ubiquitous part of warfare. They can be used for surveillance as well as for surgical strikes, and the Ukrainians sometimes as a substitute when they're short of artillery. It isn't fundamentally changing warfare, but it's allowing reconnaissance to happen at the squad and platoon level in a way that, again, if the U.S. military is not taking copious notes, we're going to be in trouble in our next major engagements or our minor engagements. I know there's efforts by the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Army to rethink of how to use drones, but the way we plan on acquiring them and developing them is far short of what I believe is necessary, and I don't believe I'm alone in that thought. I spoke about drone warfare. The Ukrainians' ability to use drones for surgical strikes previously, when they were short of ammunition due to the lack of American shipments, they were using drones essentially as replacements for artillery barrages. But when I spoke to some units, I was allowed to watch as they conducted a drone offensive. And their ability to use drones to target Russian officers, Russian command, and damage Russian armored fighting vehicles, even modern tanks, was impressive. The way they conduct and use drones, not just as part of the offensive, but as sort of a third way of attacking the enemy. You know, you can strike them with artillery, you can lead an infantry assault, an armored assault, or you just use a drone, essentially a drone raid, where you fly over to the Russian trench, hit them with a wave of explosives, maybe 2 waves, go for like a double tap, and that's it. It's just a way to trip the Russians before they can attack. On the other side, the war in Ukraine has become sort of an arms race as the Russians and Ukrainians try to one-up each other in their ability to jam drones, mostly using technology that jams GPS and other such technologies. Basically, every time the Ukrainians or the Russians come out with a new drone, the other side will come out with a new way to jam it. Both the Ukrainians and the Russians have been working on drone systems that automatically switch frequencies that allow them to keep flying. It's really impressive, frankly, on both sides, how the necessity has spawned such impressive creativity. Artillery, much to say about the tactics. I just want to give one thought to those in the audience who pay attention to the constant news about the dilapidated nature of the American defense industry or the transatlantic defense industry. Speaking from personal, very serious experience, nothing will focus your mind about how scary it is to be outgunned and outmanned than when you're sitting in a dugout trench about 8 feet of earth above you and you're taking artillery fire for about 3 hours because the Russians, as backwards as their economy is in some ways, it's strong now. Some economists say it's sort of overheating due to the war industry. But the Russian ability to produce munitions should worry pretty much anyone in range of Russian artillery. I cannot say enough about that. But at the same time, the U.S. investment and also the investment of our allies is slowly restoring the American ability and our allies' ability to fight both long and high-intensity wars. To speak a little bit, as in the news you hear about like the efforts to push for negotiations, efforts to bring the Ukrainians to the table, bring the Russians to the table. I think that's an earnest effort and understandable. But while speaking to Ukrainians, again, at all levels of Ukrainian society, civilians, soldiers, Ukrainian journalists, Ukrainian politicians, Ukrainian think tankers and academics, intellectuals, Ukrainian resolve to fight this war through is not only remarkable and inspiring, but I truly deeply believe it's something that the U.S. should take inspiration from, because as the U.S. has engaged under different administrations of different parties, a 20-year war on terror, war in Iraq, war in Afghanistan, now supporting the Ukrainians, preparing for a confrontation with China, either in the South China Sea or across the Taiwan Strait. Many people have heard this before, but the inability for American administrations to articulate the need for victory in any of these conflicts or define what victory means, I think is both a strategic and a moral failing of American leadership, something I've heard from IWP professors and faculty, something that we cover a lot in our work of IWP and our studies and the books they have us read and the essays. The Ukrainians they know it's going to be tough and they know it's going to be long, but the Ukrainians have a goal of victory. And they have, when you talk to people, they have solid plans for it. Those plans do involve a lot of Western support. Those plans involve a lot of bloodshed from Ukrainians. Also involves quite a lot of bloodshed from the Russians. So they're not taking this trivially. But Ukrainian resistance to this assault should make American policymakers and policy implementers think about what it takes to win a war. Not just grit, but also strategy and commitment and really understanding your enemy. The picture in the back there is the sinking of the Russian ship, the Moskva, the capital ship of the Black Sea Fleet, which the Ukrainians sank in 2022 with a domestically produced anti-ship missile. One that they're actually quite eager to sell to the US because since they've sank so many Russian ships, they're actually finding less need for anti-ship missiles. So lessons we need to learn from this. This is not just about why we should be supporting the Ukrainians, which I'd hope people take that away from this and other reading on this, but we should be learning from the Ukrainians how to fight and win wars again. We should be learning from the Ukrainians what our enemies are capable of, what they are willing to do to achieve victory. The Ukrainians take the Russians deadly seriously. They mock the Russians for their occasional operational incompetence, but when a Ukrainian battalion commander sits down with you and talks about how terrifying it is watching the suicidal charge of the first wave of a Russian infantry assault, knowing that you're going to run out of bullets before the Russians run out of men, and the Russians are willing to throw hundreds of lives away for one trench, thousands of lives away for a fortification line, it really should sharpen our mind both what future war can look like and also not underestimating our adversaries' ability to kill us and kill their own men. I wrote a piece a while ago for the Center of European Policy Analysis's journal, Europe's Edge, about the history of Russian war crimes and just the Russian use of brutality as a military tactic. Going back to the Russian Empire, the Circassian genocide, especially the Red Army's crimes, both during World War II and in Afghanistan, and also the Russian war crimes in Ukraine. We remember the liberation of Bucha in spring 2022, where we saw hundreds of Ukrainians, hands tied behind their back, shot in the head. Since writing that article, I should say, the Russians have struck a children's hospital with a multi-million-dollar cruise missile. They are hunting civilians in Kherson, and recent reporting has shown there's been a major uptick in Russians executing Ukrainian prisoners of war after their capture, which also on the diplomatic front, we should think about if that's the Russian definition of peace in Ukraine, we need to be considering what we are asking of the Ukrainians and the Russians. So, and there, I brought my "What Would Reagan Do" shirt, and you'd be impressed by how many Ukrainians saw that and came up to hug me, including Ukrainians about my age, which of course was probably a effort on their part to ingratiate themselves to the Americans, but I can't really blame them. Ukraine is standing, the Russian defenses are rough, and America needs to consider what we're getting out of this war. In my mind, victory is very much on the table. It's going to be costly, it's going to be hard, but the Ukrainians, when they communicate to our leadership and they communicate to people like me, they stress how this isn't a choice between war and peace. It's victory and survival, surrender and destruction, which they have their reason for thinking that, but also I think that's just an important way that scholars my age and up-and-coming policy experts need to think about war in the 21st century between great powers. Here's some recent pieces I wrote about the Kursk invasion, spoke about the issues of diplomacy with people like this. I also wrote a bit about Biden administration efforts to negotiate with Hamas, Hezbollah, and thus the Iranians, and about fortifications. In conclusion, I want to just show two of my favorite pictures of war memorials. On the top, this is the American cemetery at Normandy. I did not take this picture. I could not take a picture that nice. On the bottom, also not by me, is a picture. This is in Independence Square in Kyiv. These are the flags placed for the fallen. And this is a picture I found. Unfortunately, I wish I could show how many American flags are there due to American volunteers either who have gone to fight or serve as medics who've been killed on the front line. Pristinely clean, regularly replaced American flags placed by the Ukrainians to honor the help we've provided. Here's my email. There's my Twitter if anyone is interested in following me, seeing my recent publications. I'll have some more work coming about my travel and work with the Center for European Policy Analysis, with Providence Magazine, with the Institute on Religion and Democracy. I'd love to take some questions while we still have time. Hope I didn't go too over. So when I was in Ukraine, actually, a lot of my sort of casual research is trying to figure out what amount of American supplies are coming in. They get a handful of American drone supplies, but overall, when they do, it's normally commercially available drones that the U.S. can buy. And increasingly, the Ukrainians are relying on either domestically produced drones or drones produced in the Baltic states. Lithuania just made a deal to send about 1 million drones to Ukraine over the next 2 years. So also speaking of our allies, the investment in cheap, easily replaced drones, cheap, I'm talking between $500 to $1,000 a model, is significant. I think the U.S. is failing. This is an issue, a deep issue of Department of Defense's acquisition process, is it's just too hard for us to think of how we can start buying essentially Walmart drones and using them in our military operations. So what we're sending to them is almost certainly, especially because mostly it's drawdown, so it's older equipment, is certainly not the sort of agile stuff that's used on a modern battlefield. Oh, I believe there's a microphone.
Do you think we'd be better off helping the Ukrainians get a lot of South Korean artillery shells or supplying them ATACMS? Which do you think would be more important at this point to try to stem the tide of Russian advances?
When I was in Ukraine speaking to artillery batteries, their supply of artillery shells was actually pretty solid. The big problem they had is they had a mix of old Soviet and NATO-supplied howitzers. The Soviet howitzers used 155 millimeter. U.S.-provided ones use 155 millimeter ammunition. The Soviets use 152, and they're essentially running out of the old Soviet stuff, which leads to them having a lot of just guns sitting around and rusting. But their supply of American shells, also South Korean, and increasingly shells produced by Rheinmetall, the main German defense contractor. So while they always can use more long-range strike capability is definitely something they need. And as I said, if I am giving a policy prescription, the Ukrainians definitely need the ability to use these to strike legitimate Russian military targets on the Russian border. It's been proven again and again that Putin's red lines about the threat of nuclear force are a bluff that the Ukrainians have called, last count, 40 times. The Kyiv Independent, I believe, has an ongoing article they update every time that one of Putin's red lines is crossed and he doesn't nuke Ukraine or nuke Berlin or whatever.
I've been reading a little bit about the Ukrainian efforts to overcome their smaller forces versus the Russian forces. The troops are way overbalanced on in the Russians' favor by cutting off their supplies, and so they've had to develop drone swarms and take out supplies and supply centers behind the Russian lines, and they're also developing their own medium-range missiles because we won't supply them any. Where does all that stand? Do you see any results of that?
The Ukrainians actually have tested recently a medium-range ballistic missile. I don't know how quickly it will go into production, but hopefully see that. The Ukrainians' ability to use drones to strike Russian logistic chains is nothing short of miraculous. The issue they're running into is, one, the Russians are getting better at jamming those drones, shooting them down, and other ways of defending against them, ways they simply couldn't do against ballistic missiles or without severely spreading out their more conventional air defense systems. And the other problem is the payload the drones can deliver, while increasing greatly, and I've seen some of them take off, it looks like it's about to crash to the ground because it's overladen with explosives, but they're developing drones that can carry more, but nothing can really compare to what can be delivered by a cruise missile or ballistic missile. Not to mention the range, because these drone operations also often involve special operations teams getting very close to Russian lines or even crossing the Russian border to execute these. But it is both impressive and also should worry American logistics planners in future wars on the ability for small infiltration teams of drones to do serious damage to logistic lines.
Thank you for your presentation, Mike. I'm curious, early on in your comments, you made a statement that caught my attention when you said that we really don't have, or we're really not learning from the experience that we're going through about some of the tactics and strategy that's being implemented by the Ukrainians, and needless to say, it's unique in the sense that any force that can conquer the Russians in anything is just a real plus for them. But who do we have on the ground that's monitoring and being able to learn from the Defense Department or whatever department that's supposed to be in charge of assisting? You made a statement that you didn't think we were learning much or something to that effect from all of this.
Well, from my time there, obviously, even though I'm very loudly and obviously American, as I walked around Eastern Ukraine, no one came up to me and was like, oh, actually, I'm actually the CIA officer for operations here. And Washington Post, I believe, reported a few months ago about the history of, say, CIA operations in Ukraine going back to the war in the Donbass, especially around 2015, 2016. I have to hope that the U.S. has intelligence operations. I know we have intelligence operations supporting the Ukrainians, but on the ground collection. Department of Defense personnel and contractors in an official capacity are not authorized to be in Ukraine. We don't even have guys supporting Ukrainian logistics, say, in Lviv, which I've written about in the past that would be something worth considering, is just learning about how the Ukrainians are managing the logistics of this war by assisting them in the safer areas of Western Ukraine. If we have covert activities in the region, I hope they're taking notes, but otherwise, from my research, which is relatively extensive from professionals I've talked to, some at IWP, we're relying on secondhand reporting. We're relying on the news. We're relying on what the Ukrainians say. The Ukrainians, in my experience, not just the military, but also their intellectuals, academic support for their national security enterprise, are happy to communicate these things. The Ukrainians are quite comfortable with being a classroom for us if it means we continue our support. But in terms of firsthand knowledge, I believe it's coming from journalists who've been embedded there for a while, who are knowledgeable enough on military tactics and technology to write about it and then communicate it to scholars and defense planners.
A couple of weeks ago, I was talking to Michael, great presentation. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking to Admiral who'd been to Ukraine many, many times and is going back, probably he's maybe there now. And he was commenting on three things, which you touched on two of those things. One is that a primary motivation of the Russians, he thinks the primary motivation, is going after minerals, including rare earths, and including things that you didn't enumerate. And so you can comment on any of these that you want. The second one was, and you did mention about the extreme innovativeness of the Ukrainians in technology, that they're generally, he thinks, the most innovative people on earth in technology, the most brilliant, without comparison. And then his third comment was that the Ukrainian women, of course you liaised with Ukrainian women in the front lines, but with men being in the front lines or killed, they're stepping up and demonstrating extreme competence in running organizations and taking care of the home fires in industries and things like that. So any further illumination on any of those?
Ukraine, before the war even, was sort of being seen as like a new tech center in Europe, up there with Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, a lot of tech companies, software, hardware. A lot of that expertise has been devoted to the war effort, not just on drones, although drones is sort of the image of the war and a highlight point, but Ukrainian cyber capability, I didn't get to witness firsthand, has had a number of major successes. Their defense industry has been spun up in an impressive way to the point that they're actually, defense industry experts in Ukraine are lobbying to sell excess supplies to European partners, stuff that they don't necessarily need as much on the front line. Like I mentioned, their anti-ship missiles. On women in Ukraine, like I said, Rima, my dear friend, she's been on the front line, basically living like a soldier except for not, having a rifle for 2 years. There are women fighters in the Ukrainian military, it should be clear, and women combat medics. One of my translators, a woman named Maria Amarichka, same story. She's a woman younger than me, I think she's about 24 years old. She's from Kalush, a city in western Ukraine, but she'd been living in eastern Ukraine for about 18 months or so, serving as a volunteer for journalists to bring them to the line, as well as fundraising for supplies. Fundraising for essentially stopgap goods that the Western support doesn't supply, drones, drone jammers, medical equipment and winter clothing, items like that. It's a huge aspect. If you hop on Twitter, there's a number of accounts, charities, and just sometimes individuals who are helping to spread the message of fundraisers for units, mostly organized by women. Ukrainian women. I actually met a number of them when I was in Kyiv because they were hosting one woman owned a bar in the suburb of Podil in Kyiv, and she was hosting like $1 drinks or something and all the money was going to buy new ballistic vests for the unit her husband was in. Really just impressive work, and I'm always happy to get beer get beer and help guys. If we have time for one more, we all good? Rare earths and grain supplies are definitely like the strategic ends to Russia's goal, and manpower. There's a reason the Russians are kidnapping Ukrainian children in the thousands, is to replace the manpower they've lost.
Just a quick question. First of all, comment as an alumnus of IWP, we're proud to have you as a student. You're the type of person we need, right? My question is the Budapest Memorandum, right, from 1994. Could you touch on our obligation to that? Many people, I'm surprised, my fellow Americans don't know anything about it, or the agreement we had to protect Ukraine, heaven forbid they ever were invaded.
Yeah, I'll touch on that briefly. I think the text and law of the Budapest Memorandum is unfortunately clear. Security guarantees, the U.S. is essentially meeting those by supporting Ukraine at all. So on the legal front, it becomes the difference between allies and partners. I've been criticized because I call the Ukrainians our allies occasionally, when really they're security partners. We assist them out of shared interest. If they're not a NATO member, all of that legal terminology is true and important in the application of foreign policy. But from where I sit and from where others sit here in Washington, the Ukrainians are our allies in the sense that the Russian government, and this is not just Putin, the Russian government, the Russian elite, view themselves at war in various ways with the West, either culturally, their efforts to subvert our elections, to subvert our democracies, not just American democracies, American elections, but across the Western world. The Ukrainians are the fighting front of the full spectrum conflict the Russians are trying to unleash on us. Rich Lowry at National Review a few months ago wrote a great essay where he said, Russia is our civilizational adversary. I think as long as men like Putin can claim and hold power in Russia, that's true. So back to the Budapest Memorandum, whatever treaties we have or agreements we have, understandings, we should honor those because we should honor those, but we should also support the Ukrainians because it's in our national interest to defeat the Russians. And I believe it was Palmerston said there are no permanent enemies or adversaries, only permanent interests. It's a good pithy quote, but occasionally there are permanent adversaries. Authoritarian, totalitarian Russia, I think, will always be an adversary to America, especially as it grows closer to the communist China and to the Islamic Republic of Iran. So memorandums, treaties, whatever they are, supporting the Ukrainians is, besides being the moral thing to do, is pretty perennially in our national interests. Is there a... Great question. One of the major answers to that is that Putin's mobilization efforts have twofold. One, relied on non-ethnic Russians from rural areas, Siberia. Russia is a multi-ethnic empire, has been since its existence essentially. So Putin is not relying in part on, when he is bringing draftees, they are coming, or recruits I should say, they are coming from non-ethnic Russian populations. And there's reporting, Francis Durnley of The Telegraph had a great article. If anyone wants to send me an email, I'm happy to send it to you, about how these rural, non-ethnic Russian towns are essentially depopulated. It's akin to the stories of after World War I, cities in the English countryside that had just lost all the men. On the other hand, the Russian recruit, like the volunteer recruit, is getting paid phenomenally well right now. I can't remember the exact calculation, but it's about 3 times as much as the average Russian salary. It comes in their signing bonus. So the Russian tolerance for suffering, it always has a breaking point. It broke in 1917. It was aided by the revolution. It broke in 1905. But their ability to tolerate the loss of, 1, non-ethnic Russians, 2, frankly, I'm not saying this to besmirch them, but I think the salaries are enough, and the delivery of pensions to war widows is helping. So, what was your second question? It's a hard thing to answer because I don't think anyone really knows for sure who comes after Putin. I do think what will come after Putin might not be the end of the war, but it'll certainly be more bloodshed in Russia. I have suggested many times when asked about, when people talk about the end of the Putin regime, and people normally mean it in a coup or, Putin falls out a window someday, and I often joke with people, Putin is 72 years old. He's about 3 years older than the average Russian man's life expectancy for the year he was born. And American policymakers really need to start considering what Russia's going to look like after Putin, because Father Time is undefeated in that regard.